Oh, okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Show Up Chicago. Thank you for coming. Just want to give you a little lay of the land before we start with the show, which is we talk to our panelists for 1 hour. We record it because it is broadcast the following Sunday on WCPT. And because our time is exact and a little short, our microphones are a little short in that way too. So we won't take questions from all of you during that hour, but we will after we close the formal part of the show. Our guests are going to stay for a little while longer to take your questions. So store up your questions, give some thought as you go along, take notes if you want, and we'll come back to you after the show.
All right, so we'll get started. Welcome to Show Up Chicago, a community gathering, a political panel show presented monthly at the Hideout. I'm Tom Moss here with Mark Halpern, and we're part of the leadership team of Blue Beginning.
So since Trump 2.0 and even before, Democrats have been struggling to find their way out of the wilderness. Some are seeking move to the right, or center anyway. Some are going to further left, some denying there's a wilderness at all, but come on, I think you see what's going on here. So for tonight's show, we're interested in what we might call the Democratic Socialist Moment. Donnie's victory in New York City was kind of stunning to the party regulars, for sure, in much of the country. Then there were the victories in New York State races, Colorado, Pennsylvania, in Michigan. It was what Tom has been calling a cold civil war between the DSA and the Democratic establishment as Abdul al-Sayed seeks the nomination for the Senate. The DSA is actually doing pretty well so far nationwide, and we have examples of successful Democratic Socialist politicians in Chicago, including one who's with us tonight. So what is it? Is it a Democratic Socialist moment, or is it a movement? Something to celebrate or be a little afraid of?
Tonight, at least, our goal is to understand it a little bit better. And here to help us do just that is our guest. Kevin Schultz is a professor and chair of the Department of History at the University of Illinois, Chicago, specializing in 20th and 21st century American history with a focus on politics, polarization, religion, and intellectual life. He's the author of several books, notably Buckley and Mailer, The Difficult Friendship That Shaped the 1960s, and his latest, Why Everyone Hates White Liberals, Including White Liberals, a History, which I will endorse. It's an excellent book. How the Word Liberal Became a Political Slur. He's a regular media commentator, having appeared on NPR's Backstory, C-SPAN, and MSNBC. Alderman Andre Vasquez has represented Chicago's 40th Ward, Lincoln Square, Westridge, and Edgewater since 2019, when he unseated longtime incumbent Patrick O'Connor, a formal community organizer. He won his first race running explicitly as a Democratic Socialist with 54% of the vote. In council, he currently serves as chair of the Committee on Immigrant and Refugee Rights and co-chair of the Progressive Caucus. Please join me in welcoming our guest for the evening.
Yeah, we'll talk over beer afterward. I think we want to start with Kevin, because the book that you have written about the rise and fall of the term liberal, and maybe liberalism itself, is a pretty good place to start. There are all these terms: liberal, neoliberalism, liberal, I've got them written down so I don't forget them, liberal democracy, liberal arts, in terms of things people don't understand today. All meaning slightly different things. So let's start. You do have that excellent book that goes into a lot of detail in the definition of liberalism, but here's what we're thinking about. We've expanded this vocabulary in the current electoral cycle, right? We've now got this kind of squishy place where three terms get jumbled up: Democratic Socialist, Socialist, and of course, Communist. All added right in it. That's right, play the music. What do those terms really stand for? How are they different from the terms that we were using? Moderate, liberal, progressive. What's happening with the terminology and the meaning behind them?
I
Thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for coming out today. It's great to be here. So terminology, I mean, I'm a historian, and I study how words get used and how they get abused and how they get changed. And the book that I just had come out on why everyone hates white liberals, including white liberals, one of the theses of the book is that the word liberal has been so used and abused that it no longer has meaning. And in fact, if you tell me what you think a liberal is, I learn more about your politics than I do about anything about a liberal. So I think we're seeing something similar happening right now with words like democratic socialism, socialism, and then recently in the last 2 weeks, I think our president has brought up the word communism, trying to create fears and evoke fears that go back to the Cold War era. Historically speaking, all of these words have a history. Communism is intended to basically define an entire system where there is no government. It's a stateless society. There's bureaucracies and things like that, but it's a stateless society, a classless society, a moneyless society, where basically people are given what they need based on how much they need, the size of their family, things like that. It's always been this ideal that's been put out there. And socialism was a word that was a road stop on the way to creating this communist ideal. So the two are not equal. I'll start by saying that at all. And socialism is an economic word that is a term that is used to signify when the workers or the people that actually do the labor own the means of production. Well, guess what? We already have lots of socialism in the United States. The roads that we all drove on, if you took the roads to get here, they were built by your tax dollars because we believe in social. We believe that society should have access to certain things, and that's what we contribute to. If you went to public schools or send your kids to public schools, that is socialism. We have hospitals where you can get free medical care. That is socialism. So we're not necessarily talking about the specter of socialism where the government is going to take over. What we're really talking about is how much social we want to invest in. And right now, the current civil war, I've been calling it that for a year, so I want extra credit points for recognizing this. Within the Democratic Party, between sort of the abundance liberals, so-called the abundance liberals, and the Democratic Socialist side, isn't necessarily a radical philosophical battle that's going on. But instead, it's about how far the circle of socialism should extend. Should we have universal health care? By the way, more than 80% of Americans think that we should. So the fact that this is even on the table in our politics is more about a closed Overton window. The spectrum of possibilities has been narrowed by our politicians. But it's really over a question of how much social we want to invest in. And so I like to personally, and from a historian's perspective, downplay this civil war that's going on within the Democratic Party. I think it's real, and I think it's important to have, because I do think the Democratic Party needs to recognize how far it wants to extend the social. I think if they paid attention to the voters, which is something you have to do, I don't, I got tenure, but you would recognize that most Americans are concerned about the cost of living. They're concerned about sort of big box stores coming into your neighborhood and closing down the other ways that we can live. So how can we push back against that? That is a question of socialism. How much social do we want to invest in, and how much do we want to preserve the liberties that sit at the bedrock of liberalism? But that's a whole different question, and I have a book about that if you're interested. You want to know about that? You like that?
Very capitalist of you, it's very good.
We live in the system, we might as well take advantage of that.
Andre, how have you navigated this language in your world?
Yeah, I think kind of as you stated, when I ran as a Democratic Socialist. I think what I learned, first there's a history of how I came to socialism, right? And I think a lot of people after 2016, I think similarly might have come to those conclusions. There's a young man from Vermont, known as Bernie Sanders, I think y'all know, that really kind of spoke less about democratic socialism and the way people kind of were prepared for it, and really talked about solutions and talked about what inequality looks and feels like in a way that actually transcends politics and really speaks to what people's experiences are, just kind of living their daily life. And so as a number of us all try to get Bernie elected, and then you watch how that all played out. We won't get into the full Democratic Party yet, but when you watch all that happen, and we were all kind of warning people as to the results, then you see that play out. And then a number of us, I think, we're trying to find a political home. And so you look and you go, well, Bernie Sanders is a socialist, although technically not a DSA member. People were trying to find a political home and then found themselves at DSA. And so I think in Chicago, that's what happened to me. I then started organizing through a fundraiser for Bernie, and then got somebody proposed that maybe I would join the candidate pipeline, kind of learn about running for office. So at that point, you kind of get trained, you get radicalized in all the good ways. I mean, every single word's loaded when you use it. And then I knocked on doors trying to bring the revolution and hear neighbors telling me to fix the potholes. So it allows you to kind of level set and realize that like public service is in some regard customer service. So when you think about every point that you made related to what socialism means, we already have it, right? Government already operates in that manner. It's just that people have different frames of reference, different terminology for all of it. So if you talk about how government can provide solutions, and I started talking about it actually through capitalist framework by saying, if you're an investor in this government, because your tax dollars make you an investor, you want to see return on that investment. And so that became an easy way to talk to folks about socialism in ways that they didn't really consider. But they recognize that if I'm paying this money and paying my taxes, why aren't the roads getting fixed? Why is it harder to live? Why am I paying all these things if it's not really yielding solutions for me? And so that's been the way we kind of run it. I think the other added experience that we have in city government is municipal government is nonpartisan. So we then don't have to have the conversations about party at the door, more than conversations about how we improve the quality of life for the folks that we talk to. And that allows us to have different conversations with folks who are not ideologically aligned at all, but who recognize that there is a benefit to having those conversations together and finding those solutions. So I think you mentioned kind of the specter of communism and socialism. Democratic socialism is really the same thing, but ultimately letting the actual constituency have their say and walk through those processes. So whether we create participatory budgeting or community-driven zoning, these are all socialist processes that we didn't just, flag as such, but all the neighbors are completely bought in. So after the first election, we won 54%. Second election, against two opponents, 78% of the vote. Not because people identified as comrades, but because they were like, hey, this stuff is getting us to take care of it, right? Neighbor is actually the category we like to think of first.
So you and Democratic Socialists are talking about the things the government needs to do for those of us who pay for it through our taxes. That sounds really logical, but now we have the president and his minions talking like McCarthy. It's the Red Scare. But I hear the senator from Missouri, I guess, one of them, saying his questioning of Todd Blanche for Attorney General. Well, now that the Democrats are covering the country in hammer and sickle, what are we supposed to do about like the Red Scare, right? I mean, that is what they're doing. But interestingly, and not surprisingly, when we hear how you explain the work of Democratic Socialists, there is overwhelming support in the polls for the elements of democratic socialism, just as there was and still is for Obamacare. But you ask people, do you want Obamacare? And they didn't want it, but how about all these things it's going to do for you, affordable access to health care? Everybody wants that. Same thing, if you talk about the Medicare for all, which, why do people hate Medicare? They're not out, that's my guess. Otherwise, they would know that it's a pretty good health plan. So, but that phrase has gotten so negative, but if you tell them what the health care would be, they want it. You tell them the things DSA stands for, and they want it. Democrats especially say in polls that they like the things the Democratic Socialist candidates have. So the labels, I think what we're getting at is the labels don't work. So how should candidates talk about themselves and their position within the party if they want to more effectively sell democratic socialism?
Sure, yeah, I think, one, I appreciate the full context there, because I think what I've been witnessing is that the labels do work, but one party is way better at utilizing them than the other. Meaning, for example, the Republican Party clearly understands how to brand things and make them the big scare, and they've done so for generations, right? So even when you talk about communism during the McCarthy era, it is a conflation between an ideology and authoritarianism. And what they're saying is, you don't want authoritarianism, but we're gonna call it this because there's an ideology that's being broadcast by the authoritarians here. Well, we're living through our capitalist authoritarians, and we're all under that in the United States currently. But they've been so much better at branding it that that connotation is locked in. And I think the Democratic Party is so afraid of trying to bring solutions for people and really, rather than being ambitious in their goal and hearing the problems from the constituency and trying to address them, spend a lot of time talking about the things they don't want to do and what you might lose in that exchange. And what you're actually going to lose is the constituency. And then you don't have people coming out. And so I think that it doesn't necessarily look or feel like a civil war. I mean, it does when you broadcast it in the news. But what it actually looks like is a whole bunch of people in the middle decide they're not getting off the couch. Because they go, neither party is getting it done for me, so I'm just going to stay home. And as a result, the most extreme of each side, one being clearly more extreme than the other, are the ones that come out. And they've been more effective in winning these elections. So what you're seeing right now is a public that is really tired of not having people talk about solutions. And so all you really have to do is provide the solution and a vision, which I would argue the party hasn't done a good job of. And so the joke that I crack to people is if you go to the Republican Party, you get your fiscal conservatives, and you get your folks who believe that lizard people live in pyramids and they have a shadow government. And the Republican Party goes, great, welcome to the club. And
That's a coalition.
that 100%, absolutely. And on the Democratic side, they're like, hey, how about the ultra wealthy actually pay their fair share? And the Democrats go, wait, that's crazy. You guys are radical. You guys are going to ruin the party. And then you wonder why you get the results that you do.
So, and Kevin, I want to turn to you for this. So the communist label or the anti-liberal sentiment was manufactured. Buckley to Nixon to Reagan to Cheney. So why, I guess my question, are the Republicans been tremendously effective? We didn't even mention Roy Cohn in setting up Trump's neo-McCarthyism.
We're better people for not mentioning
Indeed,
Roy Cohn.
indeed. But in all seriousness, why is the right so good at that, and the left seems to be so poor at it? I mean, we labeled ourselves progressives just so we don't have to utter the L word.
Well, there's a long history of writing attacks on the words that the left has coalesced around. Starts with socialism. We'll go on a little history tour here. I promise it'll be very quick and more enjoyable than your high school history. But socialism has been around in the United States since the early 19th century. So we're at the 200th anniversary of socialism in America, as far as political coalitions being formed around that label, even before Karl Marx. And so it's got this whole long history, utopian socialists, there were all these varieties of socialists that came about. But it really had its heyday in the United States at the other great moment of oligarchs, sort of late 19th century, the advent of the industrial age. You had your J.P. Morgans and your Rockefellers and your Carnegies, and all of a sudden the working class wasn't getting anything that they needed. There were no good schools, there were no sewers that were being cleaned, there were no sidewalks, no streets, there were no benefits, there was nothing for society because it was all being sucked up by the top 1%. And so there was a heyday of socialism in this era, and there were socialist mayors that were elected. We're seeing a lot of parallels to what we saw in the 1910s and 1920s. And if you look at the New Deal in the 1930s, after the Great Depression happens, all of a sudden socialism bends a little bit. They drop the label because they want to meld with the Democratic Party, and we get what you all learned in high school is the New Deal, which was a restructuring of the way the economic rewards of society would be distributed, and this leads, along with World War World War II, a massive redistribution of the wealth and the fattest middle class that we've ever had in the 1950s and 1960s. At that moment, the Republican Party says, we've lost. They've got the middle class. They're no longer calling themselves socialists, they're under this New Deal liberalism label. How can we win? I have a student right now writing a dissertation on the phrase free enterprise. The Republicans and the right wing were looking for words that were going to go out and grab people's attention and be a successful counter to liberalism, which was working. And they knew that the United States has this strong individualist tradition where we want to raise ourselves up from our bootstraps, we want to feel good about the work that we do, we think that anything is possible, we still believe in the American dream, for good reasons, not for great reasons, but for good reasons. And so they said freedom is the key, so they grabbed onto the word freedom, and they created free enterprise as the label that they were going to try and rally around. It wasn't successful. So what did they do? They started a bunch of schools around the country that would go in and educate business leaders on the values of the free enterprise system. And they would give them all these books written by F.A. Hayek and all of these right-wing thinkers. And they basically trained a generation on the benefits of free enterprise and the dangers and the scariness of socialism and communism. I hate to even admit this, that the Republican administration right now thinks that everybody knows history so well that they're going to label somebody a communist and it's going to still have traction. That means we know about the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s. That's great. But to get to your question, Tom, why has it been so successful? Partly because in the late 1960s and 1970s, we had the decline of industrialization, the rise of globalized production, the decline of manufacturing in cities like Chicago or Detroit, things like that, the Rust Belts, creating the Rust Belt, you might have heard that phrase. And after that happened, the Democratic Party was at a loss for who was going to be its base. They lost the union workers, they lost the manufacturers. And they made a huge bet on white-collar, college-educated people. They made a huge bet on technology, and now we know the internet industries and communications industries and things like that. And that succeeded for a while in some ways, but it led to, Bill Clinton called it the third way, where you are economically conservative, but you're socially liberal. That was the third way. And I think the Democratic ticket now might be the opposite of that. I hate to say it, and you may disagree with me, but it's to be economically radical and maybe be a little bit more socially careful. I don't know that that's the right way. And I don't know what the label is going to be that's going to encapsulate that. At the end of my book, if you finish it, Tom, I put my money on democratic socialism before, this was written a year and a half ago. So I want credit for Zoran Mandami, all right?
I think I finished the book.
You finished, right? All right, so I'm telling the truth. Come on.
Andre, do you take any heat in the ward for using the term socialist, calling yourself a socialist?
I mean, unless you count Facebook as the ward,
I do not.
right? Like, I mean, as far as a conversation with the neighbors, no. In fact, when we were running for re-election, the conversation would be not most often, but definitely, there would be a lot of conservative folks and Republicans who go, you know, I don't necessarily agree with everything you say out here, but I know that we can have the conversation, and I know that if something's going on in the ward, like, you're taking care of it. And so, I really appreciate a lot of the context, and I thought you were like doing a quick little name drop when you mentioned sewers. So, no, because in Madison, Wisconsin, and you're talking late 1800s, early 1900s, they were the sewer socialists. It is exactly how they retained power and kept moving, because what they recognized is they didn't need to sell you on the term socialism. They just knew, hey, if we take care of these services that people are asking at their door, and fix the sewer systems, guess what? They're going to be happy we did that, and that actually continues their ability to lead. Also, you don't hear Mayor Mamdani say the word socialism as often as you would imagine, because everyone else is saying it way more times than he is. But when were people rising up? They're like childcare, potholes, right? All the services were being met. The grocery store pilot, buses, which are your public transit system, all these things are things that neighbors just want to see. And so it becomes less about, hey, now that you're getting, your groceries taken care of, you're a socialist. It's deeper than that. And I think that we end up getting caught in these vectors of left and right, as opposed to how you move things forward based on the constituents you're addressing. And we get so caught up in the binary that we don't have the conversation. It's like you're framing about socially careful and fiscally liberal. Like, I just think it's way more of a spectrum than that, and I don't think it's that. It's not that people automatically respond to, hey, you're taking care of and defending trans folks or the undocumented. It's less that and more like, hey, my needs are also need to be met. So it's not an either or proposition. It's that when your needs aren't being met at all, there is a fear and a resentment that bakes in. So if you want to solve that problem, it's not, hey, let's stop talking about other people that need support. It's support everyone. So when you hear a lot of socialists in Chicago, it's everything for all. It's making sure that for the many, it's making sure that the wealthy few aren't the ones benefiting while everybody else is hurt. And there is a power built if we recognize that all these different populations are actually part of a larger coalition of folks who would kick the hell out of Republicans at that point in every election that comes up.
I had someone tell me once, when you don't think your piece of the pie is big enough, you don't want to share it. And that is what Trump is capitalizing on, right? How, why do you want to let all these, newcomers get your jobs when you don't actually have jobs? When the actual answer should be, we're creating more jobs. What did I just read? Biden created I'm not going to get the number right, but something in the 100,000s of new jobs by this point in his term,
Yeah.
whereas Trump has lost 50,000 jobs, manufacturing jobs specifically.
He's talking about that slice of the pie while actively eating the pie. While actively eating all of it.
Nobody's getting pie.
That's right.
But do you know how much money the largest percentage of Trump voters makes? So we heard a lot about the angry white working classes. In 2016, Trump 1.0, the highest percentage of voters made between $100,000 and $150,000 a year. So this is not working class. But it's also not 200,000, 300,000 where they can feel very comfortable. And he played perfectly on that status anxiety where the pie is limited and we need to be careful about other newcomers coming in and taking this piece of the pie. When I saw that statistic, I was sort of struck by what is it that is animating this anger, fear, resentment, anxiety. And that's what it is. You said it perfectly.
So this is playing out in a lot of primaries right now, where we'll put New York aside for a minute, because that's sort of a different kind of election. But say Michigan that had a three-way race. What's in the DSA back? I'll say it. You mentioned. Are we buzzing? I might be spinning out, isn't it? Yeah, all right. Yep, there we go. So in Michigan, we have this three-way race between the DSA candidate and two others kind of vying for the more moderate vote. One of them dropped out 2 weeks ago. Now it's a one-on-one horse race. We're seeing the same thing in Wisconsin's primary for governor, and it's happening elsewhere around the country where it looks like these arguments about what we're doing for people in the community, the way Alderman Vasquez has just said, play out well in a Democratic primary, but there's a lot of hand-wringing about what's going to happen in the general. And I'm just going to put it this way to you, because we hear those voices that say, well, in some districts, in some states, you're not going to be able to have such a far-left candidate win, and Democrats in the traditional side of the party feel like we're giving away our seats by not staying more to the center. And for me, I have this voice in my head. Faced with the same thing 4 years ago, well, not 2 years ago, Republicans just doubled down on the hard right. They went as nutty to the right as they could, and we have sound hard left policies. Why can't we do the same, and will we prevail in the general if we just double down on the hard left? It's a scary prospect to people who look at the center as the safe place to be. That's what got Clinton elected. That was a long time ago. So what's the path here from the primary to the general?
Well, I think a lot of people in Michigan, at least the people that I talk to, are worried that if they pick a centrist candidate, what's her name, Saunders, if they pick her, then Stevens, sorry, I knew I was off. Then they're going to lose a lot of the far left voters who are not going to turn out for the general election. And I think a lot of what those of us who are maybe frustrated with the current administration need to do is say, whoever wins this primary, that's who I'm going to vote for. They need to be able to rally behind that one candidate. And I think increasingly, the anxieties that stoked Trump's election are now being met by anxieties on the left after all that we've seen from ICE raids to economic redistribution to the first trillionaire to the consolidation of the communications network. We're seeing all of those fears and anxieties bubble up, where maybe the left and the center left will be able to come together when it comes time to the general election. Fight it out in the primary, and then put your swords down and go to battle against the Republicans. I will say one thing, and I want to hear what you have to say about this from the ground, but I will say from a historical perspective that the left or the center left or the progressives, or however you want to term that, use that language, has been at its most effective in American history at passing legislation when the far left and the center come together and unite against the fears of the right. If you look at the progressive era in the 1890s, 1910s, 1920s, say for instance when half this room got the right to vote, women is what I mean, or a million other things, the sewer socialists and things like this. That was the progressive era was the radicalism of the labor movement, the radicalism of the farmer populist movement, and then the sort of more conservative notion of the middle class coming together to change society. If you look at the New Deal in the 1930s, when they built Social Security, when they built the Social Security state that we had, that was the radical left, the communists and socialists coming together with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the liberal. If you look at the Great Society of the 1960s, again, neither side got everything they want, and I think that's one concession that has to be recognized. But under the banner of making things better, they were able to come together and actually push for social change. So I just want to put that out there. Historically, the left has been at its most ferocious and most successful when it's been able to reconcile these two wings of the party. I think Zoran Mandami gave us a great a great example of how this is done. I don't know how many of you have read his platform. He's got all sorts of things that he wants to do, but the platform is really two sentences. New York City is too expensive, that's one sentence. And the second one is Zoran Mandami wants to make life easier. What a great thing to do.
Communist, socialist.
Retail politics, right? You wanted to go bring the revolution and they asked you to fix potholes? That's
And you
retail
fix the
politics.
potholes.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah, but your picture of coalescing sounds great. It's time that this is supposed to be, vote your heart in the primary and your head in the generals. Right. But Andre, I got to give my little piece of history as a canvasser in 2016. The people I knocked doors on who I could not convince to vote for Hillary Clinton were, Bernie people. So, forming that coalition is not so easy, right? How do you do that?
I think respectfully, there's a lot of onus being placed on the left to do a lot of the lifting. When if you want to see in more modern history why we ended up the way we did, I believe, is because the Democratic Party gamed it so that Bernie couldn't win the primary. And then at that point, you end up with what was the moderate candidate who then lost to Trump. And that's more of what I think we see structurally, institutionally, is the problem. Is that you've got mega donors on all sides of the equation. They don't want to lose the power that they have. They have a certain level of control over the electeds in those parties and the institutions. So these folks would rather maintain the funds coming than to actually change the party in a way that's more successful. And you see it time and time again, both times that Trump won. Because what you saw in the Republican Party, and I'm getting triggered talking about it. I just remember, I would get in so many arguments with my father-in-law lovingly as this thing was playing out and going, you guys think Trump is a joke? He's battling 13 people in his party to become the nominee, while the Democratic Party is stopping everybody they can to make sure the nominee they want makes it to the end. And guess what? You get the outcome that you work for. And if you work so hard to do that, that's not the people deciding. That's not a primary process playing in the way it should. It's somebody gaming that system, and then karma hits. Meanwhile, the Republican Party both times had Trump take on head after head. So if you're at the point where your party has folks who are saying, we want to see one candidate, and then you watch that party stop that candidate from making it, you then don't go to those same voters and say, guess what? Now you got to do your job and vote for the person we gained and expect them to come and turn out. There's a level of resentment where they go, you know what? You think you guys got this? Go figure it out yourselves. And that is a result of not respecting the actual voter and underestimating their ability to understand what's going on and them naming who they want to represent them. So this idea of Where else are you guys gonna go? Far left? What are you guys gonna do? You only got two options. The third option is the couch. And if you want to change that, you would listen to the folks who are telling you what they want to see, provide that for them, and then you're gonna watch them knock through those doors to help those candidates win, which we saw in New York, which we're watching time and time again, when those candidates are meeting those demands.
I saw something today somewhere on social media, so take it word for it.
Yeah.
No, but it's an idea that the Democratic Party was as hierarchical, more hierarchical than the medieval church in a way. You know, that it was your turn to be president, and that you will clear the field because it's your turn. And those people whose turn it was were often 65, 70, 75, 80. And there's some angst among the moderate wing of the Democratic Party now that, God forbid, 35-year-olds are getting elected in primaries or challenging this hierarchy. And the person I saw with this says, jump the line. By all means, it's time to jump the line. I think we're seeing that play out. Mamdani jumped the line. El Sayed is jumping the line. Should be noted, he does not position himself, he does not call himself a socialist. He calls himself a progressive Democrat. But if you read his platform, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck,
Quack, quack, so then
call it whatever it is. But whatever he needs to do, you know, that's fine. So, Andre, I mean, are you seeing people jump the line here in Chicago?
I guess I think there's a problem with the line.
You jumped the line, I guess, didn't you?
I mean, sure. I think the framing, the fact that there's a line, like, if you're that exclusive as to who should be in your party, do not be upset when people no longer want to wait in line and keep it moving to find something else, right? Like, it's not necessarily a generational thing or age thing. Bernie Sanders is old as heck, and yet, if this guy came up and started to run for something now, you would watch 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds all knock through the door because it is less about how long you've been there, and it's more about, do you have the actual solutions, or are you gonna just pander to us and then not do any of those things? Even when you're watching the party fight over APAC donations, that's insane. It is so clear across the board that it doesn't matter how much money you have. If you're not dealing with the actual problems, answering the questions that the voters want you to answer, and you're not committed to finding solutions for them, and you're bickering about where you're getting your money from, you're not paying attention. You're too busy focused on where that power is currently, and not understanding that it is finite and it will dissipate, because the electorate and the public do not want that. They want you to solve their problems. So whether it's a line or not, or cutting, just get something done.
I'm glad you brought up the APAC money because that's become quite a central issue, and it's part of the APAC money that was in my here, it's the it's the APAC money, but it's also the issue of Israel, which has become so central to this debate within the Democratic Party and the factions of the party, right? Because when you're talking about people over profits and getting things done for people, whether it's sewers or whatever it is, that resonates for sure. But then enter this, maybe it's my pie thing again. Why are we giving part of our pie to a war?
Israel.
Yeah.
I think that's part of absolutely the challenge. That people are going, I'm broke here. I've been broke here. You tell me there's not enough money for healthcare. You're telling me we don't have enough money for universal healthcare. We went through a pandemic. It's a whole bunch of money starts showing up. And then what you realize is for generations how much money goes to war and militarization and all those things. And then you just get tired of getting played. You get tired of the fact that you see the money flowing while people are telling you there's not enough money. So when it comes to something, it's the Middle East or anywhere else, and this happens, right? There's an equivocation of like, well, there's genocides all over, and there's one instance where we're paying for some of it. So to have an electorate say, you know what, you gotta cut that off. The fact that the party itself is having such an internal fight for something that seems very clear what Democratic voters are saying, it says a lot about how entrenched some of that institutional power and those funds are really steering. And that is a concern. It's why the Republican Party is able to take advantage of that. And you've got Tucker Carlson sounding reasonable when he knows he's racist. right? Like, what world is that where he sounds pretty plain spoken, but the party can't get it together? Hakeem Jeffries can't. Like, make it make sense. And then the fact that the party won't look at that they won't do the autopsies, that they won't do the homework, that's more frustrating to me than whether somebody's a centrist or far left or any of it. It's like, this is pretty plain to see. And you have to think either people are really, really dumb or truly just ignoring it all because they have a different priority than the public does.
Well, they're coming along, right? Democrats have voted for withholding money for weapons to Israel. This is another terminology question. I'll go back to Kevin with this because as a Jewish person, I am very unhappy at the Republican Party's effort to make funding Israel or refusing to fund Israel an act of anti-Semitism. Because first of all, I don't feel like Trump and his minions really care much about the Jewish people. And I know the old saying, first they came for him. That's why I go out to Broadway. That's why I do things to protect immigrants because my family immigrated as well. And I know Jews are on the list, there's no doubt about it. But yet we're fighting about funding Israel, and now it's like the third rail, or has been, and it's becoming less so for Democratic politicians who are afraid to deny anything for Israel because they think they'll lose a Jewish vote. Kevin, will they?
No pressure.
75% of Jews vote Democratic in half of the last 50 years. So I think Jews are looking for a safe way to vote Democratic. I think Jews themselves are moving farther and farther and farther away from sort of an uncritical support of Israel. I think 50 years ago, maybe 75% of American Jews sort of were passive supporters of Israel, and 25 were hardcore supporters, and you had this 5% radicals who were like, no, Jews don't belong there, right? Although they were radicals on the far left, and then there were all those dissidents in New York City who we thought Israel was going to bastardize the faith. Guess what? They might have been right. And I think now that has flipped. Now 75% of American Jews are passively in favor, let's say, of a 2 or 25 state solution, depending on how you want to word this, right? They do not support Bibi Netanyahu. They do not support the continued killing of Palestinian children. Like, this is just an egregious thing. So Jews want to support the Democratic Party, and Michigan is a really difficult place for these things to come up because it's got this huge Muslim population, very vocal, very entrenched, very active, very engaged, very smart, very on top of everything. And I think Trump I've called him this, and he might hate me, I think he's the best politician of his generation. I don't think he does very many good things, but he took down the Bush and the Clinton dynasties in about 6 months in 2016. He was able to get himself reelected again. He's been the preeminent personality for the last 20 years in our politics. You can't open up your phone without hearing about this stupid guy, right? So so what he does is he can find those bruises, and he pushes those bruises, not in the good ways that we like to have our bruises pushed. And I think it goes back to what Andre's saying, is he's looking for things to distract us from the retail politics. We talked about 2016, and I want to go back to 2016, where Bernie lost, and it was Hillary's turn, and a lot of people either stayed home or maybe they even voted for Trump. Well, David Brooks, who I often don't agree with, he said that Donald Trump always has the wrong answer for the right question. And I thought, that's really fascinating. Because if you went for Bernie Sanders because you were frustrated about the cost of living, because you got a bad back and all of a sudden you can't afford to pay your mortgage payment, because of all the costs and all the things that are going wrong in our country, and then Hillary Clinton comes and she doesn't want to talk about that, but Donald Trump wants to talk about that. He wants to get that status anxiety group who makes between 100 and 150,000 but feel like they're going to lose it. He was asking the right questions. Joe Rogan, we all know who Joe Rogan is, right? The most popular podcaster in America. He was a Bernie guy. Bernie talked what he wanted to talk about. When Bernie fell and no longer was there, he went to Trump because Trump was talking about the same things, cost of living, the anxiety, how difficult it is. Nobody was out there to make life easier. I do think the Democrats are finding their feet. I think Israel is one of these issues that the Democrats are going to have to dance very carefully around. But I do think if you look at what Mamdani's done, he's kept his focus on retail politics, on filling the potholes, on the sewer socialism, and that has been his effective way to work through all of these issues.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, and he has a plurality of support of the Jewish population in New York, which is remarkable.
Yeah, I don't know that I'd call I understand why you would call Donald Trump the best politician. I think that, and I don't mean it, right, and I don't mean that in a derogatory manner. I think the way I've always termed it is like, he's an apex opportunist. He absolutely understands the opportunity. He understands how to
Isn't
market.
that what politicians do?
Not the ones who want to keep in the seats.
There we go.
But I do think like his ability to market himself, to brand opponents, to withstand attack. There is a whole era of anytime you said anything bad about a Democrat, that like, you gotta step down, get out of here. And then Trump just kind of pushes through it. I think that it's very challenging to identify how you have conversations that are more nuanced. And so, since we're talking Israel, I think it's interesting to me that it is such a challenging conversation to have in America in the current moment, where we have a fascist running the government, and clearly the people are against it, to then see it somewhere else and not be able to identify there's a difference between the government and the people being governed. You see people in Israel protesting their government. You see us protesting our government. So the fact is the inability to have that nuanced conversation, there's something very challenging to me in that moment. We should understand it more than most. Because look at what we're under right now to be able to call that out. And so I think there's to try to find the spaces to have those conversations are difficult, because it's a lot easier to take advantage of the opportunity and have people fighting against each other rather than identifying the nuance and seeing where a coalition can be built. And I think Mamdani does an amazing job of trying to find agreement rather than trying to find a way to divide and attack. That's something that's completely different that I've seen from a lot of leftist socialists, is rather than looking at everything as opposition, he's wanting to engage in a conversation and go, well, where do we agree? Because then, as Lincoln would say, right, the best way to get rid of an enemy is you don't make it an enemy anymore. And that kind of thinking actually allows you to find solutions.
Didn't the window to talk about this correlation with Israel you just talked about, didn't the window open wider when Israel dragged us into war?
Oh, I mean, that moment is what's allowed the conversation to happen. And I think the media does not lend itself to larger conversations. It's bullet points and shots and what gets the views and what is gonna stimulate the endorphins, get people worked up in a way that doesn't allow for that larger conversation. So I think it is incumbent upon us to find the intentional spaces to have them, kind of like we're having right now, as opposed to what you're watching on the news, where it's like, to your point, Joe Rogan's like, what's getting us views? Who are we getting on? Are we gonna do a cage match in front of the White House? Those things are the ones that attract more attention than the deeper conversations that are necessary.
Kevin, earlier you said that Democrats have been at their most ferocious when they've been able to build a coalition. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this tension between purity tests and coalition building. Andre, you were censured by the DSA for a position that you took in the Lightfoot administration. And so you've seen this firsthand. But I guess the question is, and what's motivating this conversation and this anxiety that we're all feeling is, more than anything else, we want this SOB out, and we want to regain our democracy by whatever means will make that possible. And if that's a move to the left, count me in. And if that's a coalition between the moderates and the leftists, count me in. But we have to get there. And so how do we build, how do we convince people that we can build those coalitions? What is the rhetoric that we need to use? And we don't have a lot of time.
Well, whenever, I'm hopeless, I fall back on two things. And one is action, which is what we're doing right now, and you all do very, very well through Indivisible, so thank you for your action. And I'm sure we all have our own forms of action. And then I'm also reminded of James Baldwin, who said whenever I was feeling alone in the world, I just sat down and read and realized that everybody's been here before. So for me, that's history. So I read history and recognize that the United States has been here before. There have been internal threats that have tried to take away our democracy. After the most recent presidential election, I was pretty demoralized because I was afraid of democracy, or for democracy. But I was also like, well, it's their country now. I had a moment. And then I went back and I realized, no, we need to fight, but they do have some some legislative majorities. So it's been really heartening to watch the American population stand up, and the No Kings rally, you brought those up. They have those every week in Israel, just putting that out there, No Kings against Netanyahu instead of against Donald Trump. To see not just those large coalitions, but people going to Minneapolis, people going to Michigan. So this is sort of the way that the Democratic Party or the left, the progressive left, has been able to mobilize. I do think that there is more fear now on the left, which is not a great thing, to recognize that the winning hand you play at the midterms is the candidate that I'm going to vote for is the one who is to the left of the Republican Party, right? Whoever that is, if it's the center, if it's far left, in Michigan, we're going to see this in the Senate race, right? We're actually going to see, can the Democratic Party have that realization and wake up to recognize that we have these existential threats that are on the right. The Republican Party's basically given up on being an instrument of democracy, and they've folded to the MAGA core. That's never going away, and that's not ever going to be a winning hand. And everything else is going to be a losing hand unless you vote to the left of that. I don't know if it will be successful, but I do think that fear and anxiety that really animated and stoked and propelled the Trump regime into power is now met by fear and anxiety on the left.
Yeah, I think it's challenging. Like in your question, you kind of framed it as there's not a lot of time left. I think that kind of thinking is what the party feels. And so there becomes this urgency rather, and then you want to take shortcuts as opposed to having the conversations, building up a coalition, getting into a room and having the conversation. That tension in and of itself doesn't necessarily help. And I'm not picking on anyone, I just think it's something, it's a human tendency that I see happen. And even in the conversation right now, we're talking about fight. You have to fight, you have to figure out who to fight. We're fighting against ourselves if it's one country. So even in that framing, you end up with a loss, right? Like it's so much harder, or it feels harder to build as opposed to fight. And I think you mentioning the censure in 2020 actually is very helpful in that conversation. It's high school. In high school, and it affects everyone figures out what clique they want to be a part of, what crew they want to be a part of, who they talk to, who they don't talk to, and there's this inability to actually build what is a larger community. And so when you feel like you've been made the outsider, as a lot of leftists do, you then create your own clique. And you go, well, you're not cool enough to hang with our crew either, so let's find a way to make sure you're not actually considered a socialist. And like that's kind of what I experienced, right? In that vote, myself, Maria, and Mike Rodriguez voted to mitigate harm because there were 14 conservative, moderate to conservative members of the council who would have more easily voted for a budget that would have brought down the property tax and laid off 1,000 workers. So city government laying off 1,000 workers during a pandemic is not something I could in good conscience ever try to support. And if it's in my job to keep that from happening, I'd rather vote to secure what was a less austere budget than a worse one. But rather than have the analysis and conversation, people felt spurned by it and said, well, you're not one of us. And the part that I'm getting very personal because I went through this emotionally for a number of years, is that even in that there's sectarianism. You've got the socialists that I more identify with, you're talking your Martin Luther Kings, your Fred Hamptons, your Harold Washington, and then you've got mom and dad paid for college and I read Marx. And they all consider themselves the same tent, kind of, because they idolize one without realizing that the Black Panther Party had to figure out a way to provide solutions. That if you're a person of color in this country, sometimes you got to figure out what the win right now is because you don't have the ideology and ideal, you need to survive. And there isn't that understanding of it. And the reason why I mention it as a microcosm is the easiest thing or the most effective thing would be to build. In a room, dry erase board, what's the Venn diagram look like? But what we're more inclined to do is say, well, you shouldn't even be in the room. We shouldn't even have the conversation. And the party's been doing the same. We're not gonna get past this unless we actually take the time to hear people out. You and I talked earlier, when you go knock in a red state, you don't go, hey, I'm a Democrat, how you doing? You wanna find out, hey, what's going on? What is life for you like, and how can you make that better? If you start there in a very sincere manner, I think you get the solutions you want, and you feel less urgent because we actually had a civil war here a long time ago. we talk about this as a civil war when we actually had one. And I think we feel like it's that scary because we don't have the reference point of what that was like before. So when I talk to neighbors, they just want to figure out how to solve their stuff. We're going to work on that.
Just want to add one thing that was stunning to me, and it's sort of plugging my next book, but also exactly to this point, which is, so I've got this new project that it's called the Rule of 60 right now. Because what I've figured out, what I've learned by studying polling data, is that on any given issue, if you ask them simple questions, are you pro-life or pro-choice? You're going to be 50-50, it's actually 51-46 right now if you ask Americans that. But then if you ask a deeper question, if you have the conversations, if you get the whiteboard with the Venn diagram, what happens is instead of having this battle, you end up with a bell curve where you get 20% or something. Right now, 13% of Americans think abortion should be illegal at all times. 13%, that's tiny, right? And 25% of Americans think abortion should be legal throughout the duration of a pregnancy. But 60+% think basically rogue. It should be legal in the first trimester up to a woman's choice, and then also in the second and third trimester if the life of the baby or the mother is at risk. So you get this rule of 60. 60% of Americans actually basically have common agreement. And if you want to ask, if you look at those numbers, what's pro-life and pro-choice? It's 13% is pro-life and 80+% is pro-choice, depending on how you define it. So if you get in the rooms, if you have those conversations, the rule of 60 holds up. That middle, in the middle, interesting, I want to say this for this room, is not moderate. The rule of 60, more than 60% of Americans want radical economic redistribution. That's not a moderate position, but the majority of Americans, more than 60%, want that. Right? So it's not a moderation. I'm not making an argument for moderation. I'm saying there is common ground out there to be found, and our politicians, our pundits, and our plutocrats don't want us to see that.
We're almost out of time, but I do want to get this question in, so I might have to ask for a very short answer to what could be a very long question. New York has Mamdani. Seattle has an ESA mayor. Washington, D.C. is on their way to getting one, maybe L.A. too. So, in the home of Saul Alinsky, why is there no Democratic Socialist yet running for mayor?
You want to talk history first?
Andre, you start.
The machine.
Because the coalitions aren't built. Everything's very sectarian. Like right now, everyone's like, well, Brandon Johnson's our Mamdani. I would argue he's not. I would argue there is a whole service and solution delivery component that is absolutely missing from that equation. And yet we yearn, especially as we're watching New York. We already have our chip on our shoulder watching New York, but now it's like exponentially greater because you're watching somebody who is hearing neighbors out and delivering the results. And the scary part for me is we focus so much on the goal that we don't, when we disagree on the ways to get there, we actually break ourselves up into different categories rather than having a coalition that's going to win. But if you talk to your average neighbor out there, they're not having their needs met. So my concern is always, you can say tax the rich, you can wear the hoodie, you can do the t-shirt, you can do the marketing, you can do the videos, but if you're not actively solving the problem, not only do you end up losing the next cycle, you actually undermine progressivism to the way that makes it harder to actually continue moving it forward. And that's what I fear is the current moment we find ourselves in right now in Chicago.
And that hurts the movement, doesn't it? Because I think a lot of people think of Johnson as more progressive. He did make a lot of promises and he's struggling to deliver much of anything, I would say, as someone who did support and work for him, as I've said in these shows over the months. But so now, this is where we think we're just going to flip back to the right because the left failed. Is that going to hurt us in another very crowded election without ranked choice voting?
Shout out to ranked choice voting. That's right. That's right. I like that. It very may well occur because, and I'm just saying from my perspective, and I say this as a Democratic Socialist, you can say you're a Democratic Socialist, but if you're moving different, the results show themselves. So, I, along with a number of other alders in 2019, actively took out pieces of the Chicago machine, right? And a number of us did so being fully against that model. It's why everything I do is shared. It's independent budget office. It's looking at budget reform. It's making sure that it's transparent so the neighbors understand it. What it felt like to me is that somebody got into the seat saying that they were about that, and they got resentful that they're not able to drive the car like everyone else would. I wish everyone would just do the things I say, like if I was one of the dailies, or like Ron, and realizing that if you're really talking about creating a coalition, that means you have to listen to everybody else who may not agree with you, rather than saying, hey, you're not really a progressive, you're not a true believer, so I'm gonna stick to the 10 people that agree with me, and then you end up in what is effectively a bubble. And it's not exclusive to what I see happen with Johnson. Lightfoot did the same thing, because we are human, we're incredibly vulnerable and sensitive to critique, and then you put into a seat like that, like I've talked to folks in other levels of government, right? And I'm like, look, if you're in county, state, federal, it's great. Nobody knows the job that you're doing until you do the victory lap, right? In city government, every second of the day we're the complaint department for the public. That is absolutely the job. And so if you're not having the thick retail skin, and I work retail my whole life, if you can't handle that, and that's gonna permeate through your ability to operate, you're gonna surround yourself by yes people, and you're not gonna get the feedback necessary to actually make the changes you need. And that's what we see now. And so the easiest thing to do is, again, create a fight. Hey, either you agree with us or you're in the pocket of billionaires, right? We want to put a question on the ballot to ask people if they want to tax billionaires. You know what? I don't need to put a question on the ballot. Do you guys want to tax the rich? Yeah. Such a hard question. Let's make sure the voters show it, right? But it's easy to market that and say, look, I'm for that. They're clearly not. And the problem in city council is the other side of the equation is equally polarized and actually feeding into that first narrative. And that's not helpful for a council that should be solving problems for the people and figuring out solutions when they're fighting against each other.
Kevin, last word.
Historically, you're right. That's what I'll say. The machine has built up all this infrastructure that you can't just go and clean it up, and then all of a sudden my charisma is going to carry the day. No, you've got to do the hard work of retail politics. And you asked the question of why hasn't Chicago, the home of Saul Alinsky, had this progressive candidate or this progressive mayor? I would say yes. I would say this is the tide that we're seeing coming in across the country, and I think it will happen, and I think it will take a special person who recognizes you have to wade through all this muck, you can't snap your fingers. I mean, Mamdani himself said his favorite New York City mayor was LaGuardia. He was basically a New Deal liberal. So he recognizes the power of having to build coalitions, the power of retail politics, and I think that's coming. I mean, look at all these young candidates that are coming up through in Evanston or in Detroit. I mean, these young candidates are in their 20s, and they're speaking this retail politics language. So I think it's going to come.
Maybe the next mayor is sitting on this stage. We're going to end our program before Q&A, so let me just say, Show Up Chicago is hosted by the Blue Beginning chapter of Indivisible Chicago, as well as our friends here at the Hideout Inn. You and absent friends can watch tonight's show at our Blue Beginning web YouTube page. Just search for Blue Beginning, is the easiest way to find it. Thank you to the Hideout and new owner Terry O'Brien. Thanks to the always helpful owners, Tim and Katie Tutton. Special thanks to the terrific staff here. Tip your bartenders, treat them well. Tonight's sound engineer is Kwame Caldwell. Thank you, Kwame. John Freeberg is recovering from knee surgery, so good thoughts out to John Freeberg, who is usually here and helping us with recording. As Marge mentioned earlier, our this show will be rebroadcast on WCPT next Sunday at 7, so we thank all the folks there, as well as our Blue Beginning team, which in addition to Marge and me includes Chloe Badvig, Maureen Kuhl, Nick Rabkin, and Mike Lenahan. And finally, one more big round of applause for our guests. It's been a great conversation. Andre Vasquez. All right, we have a gentleman with a microphone if there are any questions.
Mike is in the back and he's ready. Any questions, raise your hand. And try to make them brief questions because you can hear our folks out.
It's very well presented.
That was
Very
diplomatic.
big, huge, large, loquacious answers.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for the fascinating talk. I appreciate it. And there's been a lot of talk about Mamdani in this discussion. He was recently interviewed in the New York Times, and he was asked a question about how he defines the working class. And, you know, you had mentioned you sort of mentioned the Trump base, and you're like, oh, they were making $100,000 to $150,000 a year. That's not working class. And Mamdani seems to say basically anyone who makes less than $1 million a year should be considered working class, or they work for a living, is how he defined it. And I'm curious if you agree with that definition. Is that important for us to redefine what we mean by the working class in order to create a greater solidarity and more of a coalition?
Yes, fully, right? I think when you look at the cost of everything going up and wages not, right? It opens up the working class. If you're working and you're trying to figure it out and you've got to pay bills and try to survive, you're a part of the club. Like, I think absolutely having that conversation makes sense. I think it's also why when we talk about minimum wage, the thing that always puzzles me is why nobody ever just indexes it to inflation automatically. Because then you would rise with the cost. And when you don't do that, yeah, your working class grows. I think also your average person on the street, I don't know that they identify themselves as working class. I think those are terms that are very collegial in a way that, like, your average person doesn't think about, even as they may be a part of it.
And I want to say, yes, I actually agree with Mamdani's effort to do that, because the topic tonight ostensibly is socialism. And what we've seen happen in the United States since 1980 and the Reagan Revolution was the suffocating of the social. So I teach at UIC, University of Illinois, Chicago, and in 1980, we got 80% of our income from the state of Illinois and 20% from tuition. Well, since then, it's flipped in the last 50 years. Now we get 80% of our income from tuition because the state has not given us as much. We only get 20%. So no wonder tuition has had to go up. And if tuition at a state school goes up, guess what's going to happen with the private schools? It's going to go astronomical, right? I can do this. A parlor game historians play is we talk about certain quality of life issues, and we put Ronald Reagan's face on the graph, and we put other Western democracies up there with us, and we see earlier onsets of death, lower age of living to the United States that starts in 1980. We see average wages for the working class flattens out in the United States and keeps going up in other places throughout Western Europe. So I think what's happened is we've starved the social for the last 50 years. And I think that's why all of a sudden we are all feeling very squeezed. And I think because of that, we really do have to expand our notion of working class, which historically the label comes from maybe the late 19th century, but especially in the 1930s, 1940s, when you had significant, up to 30% of the population were union workers. So this was a working class kind of visual. And so yes, let's open it up. It might not be union workers, which is now down to 8, 10, 12%.
I think at that point, right, people kind of equate it to blue collar as opposed to everyone that works. And in the absence of that, and I've had these conversations where people will look at a bar owner as your capitalist overlord. And I would look at the margins of what the folks are doing in their first business. It's nowhere near that. But because we don't then bring everybody in and say, we're all struggling, we're divided in ways. Like, it's not even the 1%, it's like a 1/10 of 1% doing really great, and everyone else is not. And it's just how we have those conversations in the world.
Thank you. Question about public services and municipalization of services. What's the role, especially local point of view on, we do have like public water, right, public transit. Where do we go from here?
I got 3 words for you. Parking meter deal. Where have we gone? We've sold off assets that were revenue generating.
Yeah.
Right? We've done everything, not we, I guess we the collective Chicago, but mayors have done everything except raising the revenue necessary and borrowed money to cover holes, and now we're selling off things that actually would help us grow. So yeah, it's why the DSA folks in Chicago and everywhere else want to democratize ComEd and looking at that as a revenue generator. Because what you have instead of these monopolies that are just feeding off of everyone while they're all going broke. So yeah, pro-municipalization, pro-democratization, and we've seen examples of the exact opposite. Now that's not anywhere near beneficial for Chicagoans.
So should we buy the meters back?
That's a different question.
We tried.
Isn't
We
it?
tried.
But we're gonna try again, maybe.
I think,
Alderman has an interesting proposal.
yeah, the trust fund, I think there's ways we should explore doing those things. I think the challenge that we see is those contracts, are those contracts. And so in essence, what you would need to do as a city, in absence of having a trust fund raised, is borrow money to buy something we sold and hope that it actually makes more than we borrowed in a world where there are, I would say, a level of diminishing returns, which is why the current owners are looking to sell to begin with. And so
That's
that's
the most
also,
capitalist thing I've ever heard from a socialist.
you gotta know how to break it down for people, you know?
I would also add that there is this sort of descending cycle that when we stop investing in the CTA becomes an increasingly unpleasant experience. And you will never make me hate taking the L train, but there are times when I'm pretty tested on how much I hate taking the L train. I'm still gonna give them my 250 or whatever, but it's not an enjoyable experience all the time. And I think that is a deliberate right-wing attempt. You see it in Europe with the NHS in England, right? We're gonna underfund national healthcare system so that there are long lines, and then all of a sudden we're gonna use that as proof that the system doesn't work, right? That's baloney. And I think, not to come back to Mandami, but I think one of the things that he's doing is he's showing us that there are ways you can mobilize that don't necessarily have to be constantly cutting, because that's what we do, selling our parking meters. But there are ways that you can generate revenue or make things better without having to cut. And what that looks like is going to be different in Chicago than it is in New York. But I do think, and Pritzker, when he first came in, he tried that wealth tax and it didn't succeed. I wonder, and I'd be curious actually to hear other people's opinions, if he tried it again, if it would succeed. Now, he won't because he's on Ozempic, which means he's going to run for president soon. So I think, and his haircut now, all of a sudden, is spectacular. But I wonder if he tried that now, if it would pass. I don't know.
Well, one other factor is Ken Griffin put all his money into Staffing and then moved with his family to Florida. So he's not, maybe we've taken an obstacle out.
So the new lines.
I think it's a lot of work that needs to get done, because I think you use the word tax, that connotation is what it is. And the talk track that was effective against the fair tax was like, hey, they're taxing these folks, but you're next. And you don't want to be next in line because you could win the lottery or whatever. And so I think like that narrative is so baked in that the amount of work you need to actually counter that is more than you could do in an election cycle. It needs to be genuine from the ground up and building people up. It's knocking on the doors. It's having the conversations. Because that is what we ultimately lost. Chicago was all for a fair tax. It was everywhere else in the state. And that's a lot of work that needs to be done to get those folks to understand their self-interest in voting for a fair tax.
Half of them will be Indiana, so.
Yeah, the Bears too. Oh, sorry.
Well, I think I discovered a new communist party. And, the thing is, I look at these billionaires and they all behave like a bunch of commies, but it's only for their own private little commune. This, whatever, to each his needs. If you want a law in your favor, you get it, right? So they exclude everyone else, but they are very good at being communists. And guess what? They're in the red party. So I call them the red party commies for billionaires.
I'm gonna do you one better. They actually real good at being capitalists, right? Meaning even in that conversation about the billionaires, you're like, they're being commies. No, they're being capitalists the whole time. And yet nobody calls that out and say, hey, what about the green scare of all these big money folks and these capitalists? If you say that, they label you as un-American, right?
They think that's sharing.
Right.
They believe that sharing between billionaires is totally okay, but not sharing to anyone else.
I mean, that Martin Luther King, right, refers to it as like socialism for the wealthy.
Yeah.
That's absolutely what's occurring. It's just that people don't identify themselves in that relation to go, I'm missing out. And I think more and more that is what you're seeing. That's why these candidates are winning. Because what Bernie, and I'll say this as a guy who was a rapper for 15 years, so it was a lot of very basic, plain spoken conversation. What Bernie said to us, it was real easy, is you're getting screwed. Guess who's screwing you over? And that's really as simple as it needs to be, more than whatever somebody categorizes another thing as. They go, you're not You're putting all this money into the pot, you're not getting it back. They are. And let's figure out that problem.
Franklin Roosevelt called them the economic royalists. Because he didn't want to, he knows every American just imagines themselves on their own fiefdom, so they don't want to pay taxes.
The vulture capitalists.
Yeah, but everybody hates vultures, everybody hates the royals that are overlording above you, right? But you are right. We now, as Americans, own huge corporate. We own Nvidia. We own significant portions of these giants. So you're right that the Republican Party is doing a very good job at investing in capitalist companies, but they're pulling the wealth out for themselves.
Right, there's one in the back.
Correct.
Okay, how you doing? You guys brought his name up, so it's not exactly my fault. Rahm Emanuel and a possible presidential run, good, bad, or ugly? And if bad or ugly, who do we have to vote for when the time comes?
I would say D, bad and ugly. It's not a either or proposition, it's 2 out of those 3 for sure. I think, again, like, let the primaries run. Get every candidate that's interested to run. AOC, all the other folks, and obviously I'm gonna say AOC first, but get everyone to run. You get the healthiest outcome by having that primary process. So rather than, hey, who do you think is gonna do it before you even started that, right? Let that run its course and you're gonna find the best champion because they'll be battling to get there. And that's the problem is there's not signs to me that the Democratic Party understands that. They're still gonna try to aim it rather than let it run its course and see who we actually should be supporting. That's more the concern I've got.
And let me counter your negativism by saying, you can be negative if you want, that's up to you, you're a therapist. But the Democratic bench is actually pretty deep right now. I'm not saying any superstars have arisen, but we still have the primary session to go through. But I mean, you go through the country, there's Wes Moore, there's Bashir, and I'm not saying I love any of these people, but they're credible candidates who are gonna be able to, they can complete a sentence, they can win in retail politics, to people that are on the red side and the blue side. So I mean, the party bench is fairly deep. I don't know who's gonna win. It could be AOC, it could be lots of people, but I'm actually heartened by the depth of the bench that we have, which I have not been in previous elections.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, one more.
I love security on the mic, that's good.
Your hands are up. There are 2 states where Indivisible is sending a lot of people to knock doors right now, Wisconsin and Michigan. And both of them have very interesting races, where in Wisconsin, Democratic Socialists may very well win the Democratic nomination for governor. And in Michigan, the progressive Democrat may win the nomination for U.S. Senate. The question that sort of comes to mind, it in a way I was reminded of it when Andre talked about the experience of people after Bernie lost. Is whoever wins, we got to expect both of those, the Democratic parties in both of those states, to coalesce around the winner. And the question that I worry about in both cases is if Hong wins in Wisconsin and or Bashir, Syed, thank you. God, wins in Michigan, whether the Democratic establishment will unite in those 2 states. And I'm just curious about what your perspectives might be about that. I'm asking you to speculate because none of us really know.
You saw it in New York, right? What did the party do? Can we get Cuomo back from the dead or something? Can we figure this out? Right? And I think that's actually where you lose people. Because if you have a fair sport and somebody loses, they're willing to accept the outcome of that. But when you've gamed it to the point that the process itself doesn't have integrity, no one's going to come back to that, right? Whether it's the party or our more progressive wing. If you think that system has been gamed, you can't expect them to come back because they feel like you cheated to begin with. And so I think that's the problem you have to address about the process in and of itself. And the challenge you have, that you're articulating, is one that I don't know. Because it's not necessarily about Democrats, it's about the wealthy establishment Democrats, and are they willing to put some skin in the game if they don't end up being the victors of it? And we're finding out. But again, we saw it in New York. They tried everything they could. They didn't want to endorse the winner of the primary. They did everything possible to stop Mamdani from winning. And then even when he won, they made it like, well, maybe we'll have a meeting with them, right? I don't know what to do with that, because we're all watching it in real time, but you're losing the electorate that way.
Well, let's finish the story. So then Mamdani won, and he did not bring about the communist revolution. And now he wants to fill potholes, and now he wants to make peace with the Center Party. And so he's actually providing an example for the mainstream Democrats that the DSA is not this big scary monster that they need to be afraid of, but just somebody who wants to talk retail politics and redistribute the economic wealth in our country. So if we finish that story, the lesson of Mamdani doesn't end where you ended it. And I'm a hopeful guy, so that this is me being hopeful, is I do think out of fear and anxiety of the loss of our democracy, I think the left will coalesce. Will the big money come around? I don't know. But I do think that Mamdani has taught the big money that they shouldn't be scared of the DSA.
Okay, maybe on that note, we can stop. I'm tempted to add, if your team loses, what else you've got the third choice? You call the president of FIFA.
Shots fired.
The municipal cycle starts July 28th. People do not know that. Figure out who's running in your ward, into the board, how people win those seats. That is important, very important.
We had this play out right here. The cat Abu Ghazala versus Daniel Biz.
Yeah.
And she jumped the line. She was too young. She wasn't from here. Socialist, anti-APAC. And Daniel Biz, she hit him hard, being a mainstream. Bottom line, they did an ad together. Did you see that?
No, I didn't see that.
They did
Well,
a
that's
funny
good.
advertisement together where they did a reenactment of Jurassic Park, and they discover this wild